Hello and good morning, everyone, and welcome to your early morning briefing for Friday, the 18th of October, 2024. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. Start off with a couple admin notes here. Number one, you can join the early morning team. Myself, Mark, Robert, and Jared. And you can also welcome back Max Morton to the early morning team in today's early morning roundtable. We'll start the stream live at 10 a.m. Central on the live stream tab in the Early Warning Network app. It's both on mobile and web. We'll hold a formal discussion on the election and post-election fallout. We're going to do a deep dive into this latest Department of Defense Directive 5240.01, which has a very interesting name. It's called the DoD Intelligence and Intelligence-Related Activities and Defense Intelligence Component Assistance to Law Enforcement Agencies and Other Civil Authorities. We'll discuss that. And then also the biggest risk areas we see developing through the end of 2024. As always, it is going to be recorded and available for viewing shortly after the stream ends. And then also later today, we'll send out a separate white paper on this DoD directive. There are a lot of people who had questions and wanted to know exactly what it says. And of course, it's written in a lot of defense speak and legalese, but we'll break it down for you. It was a little concerning to me just reading through it. All right, with that, I want to bring Jared on for today's top need to know item. This is interesting. Jared, you and I have had this discussion a few times before. How China views nuclear weapons. And apparently, you told me this morning that essentially China expects, once North Korea and South Korea go to war, they expect that to go nuclear almost immediately. You said, what are the details here?
Yes. This is coming from Tong Zhao. He's a Chinese born Chinese nuclear doctrine expert. So he's very well versed in exactly what they're thinking. And he said that China worries about North Korea's increased reliance on tactical nuclear weapons and believes North Korea will use them very early, if not immediately, in a regional war.
Mm-hmm. That is concerning. Also, you have a note here about China. By the way, does South Korea? I actually don't know. Is South Korea a nuclear country? Do they have their nuclear weapons of their own?
No, they've been discussing developing nuclear weapons of their own. And just
Mhm.
this summer, the U.S. formally said, "You are under our nuclear umbrella. We will respond if North Korea nukes you."
Mhm. All right. I didn't think they were nuclear power. Does this not mean if North Korea does intend to kick off this conflict on the KP, the Korean Peninsula, is this something that North Korea would like to do? Use nuclear weapons before South Korea develops nuclear weapons of their own? It just seems like this is a pretty important window. And I'm not saying it's in North Korea's interest to use nuclear weapons, but if this Chinese nuclear expert guy is correct, I mean, it seems like North Korea probably wants to do that before there's a nuclear response from South Korea.
It certainly seems that way. I don't have a good enough read on North Korea's exact opinions and doctrines to be able to say yes, they definitely want that. But yeah, considering the Chinese are going, yep, they're definitely going to use them. I think that's a pretty good read.
Hmm. And do you see this Tong Jiao guy as is he is he a mouthpiece or is he a reliable source on what the Chinese Politburo is thinking here?
I think he's a reliable source. I don't think he's a mouthpiece because he went out of his way to say some stuff that would get him disappeared inside of China,
Mm,
specifically commenting on the inability of their government to do certain things. So that he seems like he's at least allied here, but is still reliable because he has connections and is able to read natively all of the language and knows where to look.
mhm. All right. He also said he also commented on China's nuclear doctrine, which we've talked about before. China officially, do they officially now have a first use nuclear doctrine?
They do not officially have a nuclear doctrine, and one of his key points was that China does not have a clear grand strategy for nuclear use either. Basically, he said explicitly that China perceives itself as entirely reactive to the United States' actions. And then went on confirming this, saying that even at the operational level, the operational planners have not thought through at all what the best operational doctrine is to achieve a strategic counterbalance. So they have nuclear weapons. They know how to use them, but they don't know when or why to use them.
Hmm. I seem to recall a discussion, however, that China essentially did say that they would adopt some first use
Y-
nuclear doctrine if they believed that the United States, for instance, were going to use nuclear weapons.
Yes, when I went through the Chinese 2020 Military Science Journal, they were talking about it. It is not a first use option, but if they believe they are about to be attacked, they authorize the use of
Hmm.
nuclear weapons. So
Hmm.
it's not definitely first strike, but as long as they believe they are under attack, they will conduct the strike preemptively, which would be a first strike.
Hmm. Right. And then also, lastly, here, finishing up on this item, this is pretty concerning. So apparently, they have are they ballistic missiles, and so they have conventional bomb warheads, and then also it's dual use, so they can have conventional warheads or nuclear warheads. And as I understand it, part of the problem is if they launch these missiles off towards the United States or towards U.S. Army bases in the Pacific, say in a war time scenario, we are not going to be able to tell if it's a conventional missile or a nuclear tipped missile. This seems like a big deal. What's going on here?
Yes, dual use missiles are pretty common throughout the world because it's just a warhead. They're pretty much plug and play. China is looking to conduct deterrence by having uh, basically a symmetrical response to anything that the U.S. has. The U.S. currently has the Typhoon missile system, which we've covered a lot, and they can strike inside of the homeland. China has a
Now,
significant
when
interest.
you say strike inside the homeland, whose homeland are we talking about?
The U.S. can use a Typhoon missile system to strike the Chinese homeland.
Okay, all right.
China is looking for a way to strike, to at least have the ability to strike the U.S. homeland. Since they cannot station a mid-range missile system in Hawaii, their best option is to have a conventionally armed intercontinental ballistic missile, which pretty much throughout the world is understood that thing is going to carry a nuke.
Hmm.
They have not developed it yet, but they have an interest in it in order to have that symmetric response. And considering that in the same speech, Zhao is saying, hey, they're not thinking through operationally what this means. They're considering everything to be reactive. They are likely doing this in order to counter attack after the Typhoon hits them, meaning they would launch an ICBM at the US. And that pretty much, since there's no way to know what kind of warhead it has, it pretty much triggers, okay, nuclear doctrine, let's go.
Hmm. Right. Uh, yeah, it seems to be a something U.S. and Chinese ought to clear up on some back channel. But I guess China maybe wants that kind of ambiguity. It seems extremely risky.
Yes. Yes, it is very risky, but the deterrence aspect of it, they part of actually one of my additional notes here, they think that nuclear threats worked for Russia. We have different opinions here, but they do perceive that as working. So they're willing to step up in order to say, hey, we will also nuke if we need to.
Hmm. All right. Thanks for that, Jared. We'll bring you back on here for the rest of the global sit rep a little later. For now, let's jump inside the Beltway. We're going to bring Robert on. This is interesting. So, I've followed Ray Dalio since 2016. He's repeatedly said the United States, he thinks, could be headed towards domestic conflict. I guess depending on what side of the bed he rolls out on, he seems sometimes more optimistic, sometimes more pessimistic. But he recently said something very interesting at the Future China Global Forum. What was that?
Good morning, Mike. And yeah, that was earlier this morning in Singapore. And he said that, quote, the mere fact of the discussion, referencing the chance that both parties might not accept the result of the election in November is taking place, underscores the uncertainty about the orderly transfer of power in the U.S. And he also said, I'm not optimistic, or he's not optimistic of us moving towards a multipolar world as a natural consequence of this uncertainty.
Mm-hmm. Before the show, we were talking. That's a little confusing here, and not seeing the context, not seeing the sentence before or after. It kind of seems to me like Dalio is saying we the the assumption is that we are moving towards a multipolar world, but if the U.S. poll collapses into a civil war scenario after this election, then we may not have a multipolar world. We may just have a unipolar, a very rapid shift towards a unipolar world. And on that topic too, like I said, Dalio has been not predicting, but cautioning leaders, warning people about a potential U.S. domestic conflict here, breaking down broadly between socialists and capitalists. It doesn't seem like we're there exactly yet, but people have in the chats, in the comments, people have talked about Martin Armstrong and these other people. Elon Musk is saying this is the last election we'll ever have if Kamala Harris wins. Martin Armstrong, who's an economist, and he's built a big following for a number of reasons. He's also said this is going to be the last election in U.S. history as we've known it. It's a little concerning. Let's maybe delve into this topic on today's early morning roundtable. I think it deserves some due diligence. Maybe we can talk through that as well. Any other comments on that topic, Robert?
Yeah, just that, he has, I think you've talked about it a lot. He's invested a lot in China. And I think that his analysis on this is that, the U.S. is in danger in this developing multipolar world, especially if it's, disunified. And like you said, this then moves that pole over to these, this growing anti-West bloc that includes Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea.
Mm-hmm. I also saw where BRICS launched some kind of BRICS pay system now. I guess it's not in a BRICS currency, but actually, former General Mike Flynn was talking about that. I think he shared that, and he said, "Hey, by the way, it's a good time to start buying gold." And Flynn may be in the Trump administration also. All right, so let's move on here to this item from CISA. Apparently, we've long known, it's been a decade now. Iranian-backed hackers have been getting access to U.S. critical infrastructure. Apparently, CISA has a new warning out about exactly what they're doing, and what is that?
Yeah, CISA and the FBI released this joint cybersecurity advisory earlier this week, and they said Iranian hackers have been targeting government, energy, and IT and healthcare networks since October 2023. And they said that it looks like their goal is likely to obtain credentials and get new network reconnaissance in order to sell that information to cyber criminal groups. And we've also, seen this reporting of a significant jump in things like ransomware attacks on some of these networks.
Mm-hmm. It seems to me that this appears to be a relatively low likelihood. The Israelis said they're not going to target Iranian oil infrastructure. But if they do, Iran is dependent on those oil exports. It really seems to me like a good course of it's a forced course of action. But Iran could, in many ways, maybe become like North Korea and engage in cyber crime to fund the government there if they can't, if oil exports are disrupted. And I'm apparently selling this network information and I guess whatever passwords they're scraping out of this stuff, the credentials, maybe could be one way to do that. Thanks, Robert. We'll bring you back on. I do want to bring Mark on to talk about this latest note here, also from DHS. Apparently, the second flight of Chinese illegal immigrants has left the United States, deporting, according to DHS. What's going on here?
Hey, good morning, Mike. Yeah, so this is the second flight that we've had. We have a group of Chinese migrants. DHS hasn't told us how large that group is, but it sounds like it's about the size that would take a chartered flight. So right now, the DHS the DHS head, Alejandro Mayorkas, he was saying that that not only is this going to be the second deportation of Chinese migrants, which likely came across the southern border and then at different points of entry in the United States. But he also released a statement where he said that Chinese nationals without a legal basis to remain in the United States are now subject to swift removal. This kind of comes on the heels of news that we have government data that came out just recently showing that up to about 56,000 Chinese migrants were encountered at the U.S. border or at ports of entry in 2024 up until May. So that number could likely be higher, lower. We're not sure. We'll wait for the government data to come out. But yes, this is the second deportation of Chinese nationals from the United States. under
Mhm.
this administration.
That is this year or two over the past 3.5+ years?
From what I've been able to find, there could have been others that were not released, but we know that this is. It sounds to me like it's just 2 deportations over the whole term of the Biden presidency.
Mhm. Yeah, it's amazing. This is if we had a fair media environment, Ford Observer wouldn't, or Early Warning Network really wouldn't need to exist if they actually did their job. So I guess we should thank them for us being able to exist. But it just seems like this should be a major thing also. So Mark, thanks for that. And we'll jump into the domestic income. Another note on power shortages. I don't want this stuff to become repetitive, but Robert, this is just another source providing some confirmation about how at risk the United States is, a handful of regions specifically, how at risk they are for power shortages starting next year. We talked about reserve margins dropping. We've talked about demand increasing. This latest is from Wood Mackenzie. They're a data analytics firm. And what are they saying?
Well, they reiterated some things we've been warning about for probably the last year, and that's including this, flat power generation over the last roughly 10 years. And they said that in this new report, the U.S. economy expanded by 24% in the 2010s, but that was decoupled from electricity demand, which remained unchanged. And they said actually the electricity utility industry has been caught flat-footed. While this impact from data centers, reindustrialization, electrification, they said could result in a demand growth of 4 to 15% per year through 2029. And like you said, this depends on the region of the United States. There's a couple of things here that we have pointed out. One, that there's a slow pace of connecting new power generation. These planned retirements for coal power plants especially are driving down supply. And the availability of equipment, including transformers and breakers to connect these new plants, is hindering new generation coming online. However, there's something here that I thought was very interesting was that there are, they pointed out in this report that what would really hurt the supply and demand imbalance would be data centers replacing these retired and retiring coal power plants to take advantage of their infrastructure. And that's already started to happen. And there were 3 power plants, 2 in New York, 1 in Pennsylvania, that started planning this out in 2020. And in a meeting last month between the White House and some of these data center operators and AI developers, the White House said that the Department of Energy is actually going to work with these data centers to continue doing this. And this is important because if states try to turn these power plants back on to mitigate shortages, they can't do that if they don't exist. And if we see more of these data centers start taking over this power plant infrastructure, that's really going to hamper any kind of attempt to not only build out new power plants for this demand, but also build power plants to keep up with the current demand that'll be where the supply will be hit by these retired power plants.
Mm-hmm. Now, help me understand this. So you have these AI data centers essentially lobbying the White House to turn off coal power plants. I guess I'm not making the connection here. Why are they trying to shut down these coal power plants if they need the power?
Well, because the power plants have existing interconnections with the power grid, and the data centers, they want to take advantage of that already built infrastructure. Yeah, and instead of having to wait 5 years or more for an actual interconnection, depending on where they build their data center at, they want to take advantage of already existing connections.
Yeah. So you have like a 300 or 500 kilovolt line there, and they want access to the 300 kilovolts, not the much smaller number after it hits a step down transformer. Okay, that is. It seems like a problem. All right, we'll leave it there. That is interesting, and also on that topic here, the Department of Energy, they announced $2 billion to upgrade parts of the grid. What are they doing?
Yeah, they're going to give $2 billion to 32 transmission infrastructure projects across the country in 42 states. And they said that this is planning to build 300 miles of new electric transmission lines and upgrade 650 miles of existing lines. However, we've talked in the past about how these transmission line projects have very long timelines and they're very expensive. So I while it looks like the Biden administration is taking this power shortage problem seriously, this nuclear pivot, this money for transmission lines, it's not going, I think, to mitigate short-term power shortages starting next year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think we've run out the clock on this. If I recall correctly, down in the Rio Grande Valley here in Texas, they reconducted something like 200 miles of electricity lines, and it took them like 2 or 3 years or so to do 240 miles. So I don't know how fast this stuff is going, but you hear 300 miles of new electricity transmission lines, upgrading 650 miles of existing lines, and that's great. How long? How many years is this going to take? All right, let's move on to a little bit of campaign news. It's interesting. We're hearing some of these leaks now from Harris campaign insiders, and they've really been talking about how in trouble she is in some of these swing states. They can't imagine. They don't understand how Trump is doing so well in these swing states. They're really disconnected from reality if they don't understand how, or maybe they do understand how really, I think, unpopular Kamala Harris actually is in some of these states. But what's the latest from the Harris campaign?
Yeah, this stood out to me because, the Harris campaign has really been hitting Trump on this talk of tariffs. And according to insiders, her campaign is attempting to avoid antagonizing swing state voters by their strategies to remain vague on tariffs. But they also are saying privately that they're going to continue, quote, pursuing continuity of the Biden policies on tariffs. And I think this is one explanation for why Harris might be doing bad in swing states, because according to a new Bloomberg Morning Consult poll from last month, a majority of swing state voters actually support a 10% across the board tariff. And I think their number was like 56%. So I think this explains part of why Trump is doing so well in these swing states and why the Harris campaign seems to be, in trouble. And all of their internal polling is probably showing the same thing.
Mm-hmm. It has been amazing to watch this swing. And I asked some people, I said, is Trump responsible for this? Are Trump surrogates responsible? Is media coverage of this responsible? I talked about earlier this week that ABC Ipsos poll that found that 56% of Americans now, a majority of Americans, support mass deportation of illegal immigrants back to their home countries. That is up 20 points in 8 years. That is an extremely rapid shift. Now, a majority of Americans are supportive of tariffs. I call it a Trump effect, call it reality smacking these people in the face. I don't know, but maybe that's a reason to be somewhat optimistic here. All right, and then lastly, here, speaking of Trump, one of the things that we saw back in 2015 and 2016 are left-wing activists. They said, well, we can't get access to Trump, but we can get access to symbols of Trump. And apparently there was some vandalism at the Trump International Tower and Hotel in Chicago. What was that, Wednesday night or something? What happened?
Yeah, the Chicago PD said that a vandal threw rocks through 6 windows at the Trump International Tower and Hotel in Chicago on Wednesday afternoon. And the Chicago PD said that a witness told him a man threw the rocks and then fled before police arrived. So they're still looking for this vandal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I don't know exactly how much in damage that actually happened. However, I think I did read somewhere it's like $100,000 of windows that were broken. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. And just briefly, we'll bring Mark back on. Mark, let's talk about this EU summit there. They are actually, I guess some people in the European Union now are trying to deport illegals as well. What's going on? Oh, hey, Mark.
Yeah, this is really interesting, Mike. We've seen kind of a sea change in the last year with immigration policy in the EU. Now, we're Americans, so it's kind of hard to figure out how the EU works. Essentially, you have the European Council. That's going to be the leaders of 27 European nations. Then you have the European Commission, and this is going to be like their executive branch. So what has happened is we have this EU summit with the European Council, and they start to discuss these more stricter immigration policies for the whole EU. So they start talking about deportations. They start talking about asylum seekers and reforming that, and then also the areas of transit. What's interesting about this is that the EU Commission, their executive branch, has been siding with this internal bloc within the EU. This is countries like Denmark, Italy, the Netherlands. that have been really pushing for stricter immigration policies. And there's also been the idea that has been floated by Italy's Prime Minister Meloni. She wants to see an establishment of offshore processing centers. So she already engaged in a bilateral agreement with Albania. And what that would do is create these processing centers that are off the outside of the EU. And so you would have migrants going there. And if they're going to seek asylum, they have to go through the processing center with much stricter rules. And then those who are being deported will be relocated there and then sent back to their countries of origin. So the big picture here is this is a major sea change. And I'm already seeing ramifications from this summit. Just today, Germany's parliament has been discussing deportations, discussing stricter rules. We're seeing this in the UK. We're seeing this all over the European, in the continent, and then in the European Union.
Mm-hmm. It does seem like this is in effect. Occasionally I don't follow European politics, but I have seen AfD had a right-wing party in Germany had success. A handful of other right-wing parties in other European countries are having some success. And it really seems to me like maybe this is the EU trying to stop the rise of these right-wing parties. So very interesting to hear. Thanks for that, Mark. And speaking of Germany, we'll bring Jared back on. A German frigate assigned to the United Nations interim force in Lebanon shot down, I guess they shot down a drone or something like that briefly. Why does it matter?
Yes. So this is coming from the German Ministry of Defense. They said an unidentified unmanned aerial vehicle, a drone, but a drone that they didn't know who it belonged to. And this was off the coast of Lebanon. There's a handful of possibilities that the drone could belong to. The IDF could potentially be surveying Lebanon there, which being that this was a UNIFIL, United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon mission that could potentially be a defensive strike, because there's been a lot of IDF firing on UNIFIL forces and the president telling them, hey, get out. It could be NATO or Western, because last year we reported on a German frigate shooting at an American drone and missing. And I'm not sure if Hezbollah has any drones potentially, but I think that at least is a possibility.
Mm-hmm. Also, turning now to Mexico, the new president down there, Claudia Sheinbaum, reportedly ended a diplomatic pause with the U.S. ambassador last week. Some of these relationships, I think, have been pretty contentious. Sheinbaum, is she trying to turn the page here on that? What's going on?
Yes, she said that they did officially end it. Ken Salazar, the U.S. ambassador to Mexico, denied that the pause ever happened, which, being that there's two different stories here from both sides, I think that kind of points to some disconnect in the relationship there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, obviously. All right. And, and by the way, Sheinbaum, I think we're pretty widely expected that she will continue these AMLO policies. But one of the big things AMLO has done, he has stopped a lot of these DEA operations. He ended a task force between DEA and Mexican police as well, going after cartels and drug traffickers in Mexico. He stood that down. And at the time, this was a couple of years ago, they said, well, is he trying to protect the drug trade? And maybe that's part of it. I think he does have, no pun intended, a drug deal or he did have a drug deal, kind of a backroom deal with the cartels. However, what he's really trying to do is end U.S. influence in Mexico. Sheinbaum is 100% going to do that as well. So I will not be surprised to see these ongoing diplomatic spats continue, especially under a Trump presidency. Trump is, I think, going to go after the cartels, or try to do more to go after the cartels. And I think Sheinbaum's probably in a position where she says, yeah, they're bad guys, but there are bad guys. We don't want you to go after them. It's going to be a long 4 years with Mexico under Trump. It'll be a long 4 years with Kamala Harris with Mexico as well. All right. And then finally here, NATO is announcing a data sharing system, and they're trying to help these NATO countries adopt dual use technologies. Just briefly, what's going on?
Yep. So the big thing there is that it is a data sharing system across the entire alliance. This is explicitly adopting dual use technology, which I think is a good indicator that NATO is looking to get members' economies and industries on a wartime footing, since it is dual use. Data sharing also is a prerequisite to conducting an alliance-wide war, because you need to be able to see the same information to react to the same information. This also came at the same time as a space data sharing an increased surveillance of the Arctic via space assets, and the end use of the data sharing system will be for space operations. So I think this is all part of reacting to the opening up of the Arctic as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also this really does look like NATO's traditional defense production is obviously lacking, and it really looks like they're kind of desperate to play catch up here, especially, the Estonians came out 12 months ago, something like that, and said, well, first NATO said, oh, there's going to be a war with Russia, maybe in like 8 to 10 years. And then the Estonians came out and said, oh, it's 5 or 6 years. And now some people are saying as little as 3 years because the Russian military has reconstituted. I don't know if there will be or not, but it certainly seems like we're trending that way. So, Jared, thanks for all that. And speaking of that, one of the big topics we're going to discuss, and we're going to get Max's take on this, is a potential U.S.-China conflict / World War III in 2027. That is something like 3 years from now. And so it's just interesting to see some of these NATO officials, especially in the Baltic countries, come out and say, yeah, forget 8 to 10 years. This may be 3 to 5 years. It's 3 years away. Maybe this U.S.-China war as well. So we really are talking about a World War III scenario here. And with that, I think we do have several questions to get to. On the topic of North Korea, they've been on a pretty big show of strength as deterrence, but they seem like they have a chip on their shoulder too. What do you think the likelihood they would launch versus talk of launch? Jared, just looking at baseline activity, they escalate with rhetoric, and then they say, hey, yeah, we'll stop talking about war if you give us humanitarian aid. I mean, this has gone on for generations now. I'll tell you, it does seem like North Korea has been far more belligerent, probably the most belligerent I've ever seen North Korea. What do you think the actual risk of a war, and according to the Chinese, nuclear war, what do you think the actual risk is?
I do think the risk is quite a bit higher than we've seen in the past, just far over baseline, because first off, the North Koreans are using the word war. They don't normally do that. They said yesterday, going to the brink of war. That said, it's a baseline for a reason. And if Trump goes back into office, there's a pretty good possibility that he's able to talk them back down, because the South Koreans, the North Koreans, and the Americans all had fairly good and improving relations under his previous administration.
Mm-hmm. We'll see. It does seem like North Korea is, if they're not going to war with South Korea, they sure are acting like it, I think. Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks for that. I was in Colorado a few weeks ago. A lot of smoke from fires in Wyoming. The fires seemed to be over lithium deposits. Another coincidence. I lived in Wyoming for a couple of years, and it's a beautiful state. There are a lot of wildfires there. I haven't seen the fire map, but I would just say in general, it's dry in most of Wyoming for most of the year. And it's also hot in Wyoming for most, through the summer months. So it could be another coincidence. I haven't seen these lithium deposits, but so much of Wyoming is absolutely barren. And so it's not like they need a wildfire to just like in Lahaina, or it's not like they need a hurricane in North Korea, in North Carolina, if they're going after uranium deposits or going after whatever. I tend to doubt that is happening in Wyoming. If data centers are targeting old power plants for existing grid connections, does that mean we should be watching for similar repurposing of LNG, liquid natural gas, and other fossil fuel power plants? Robert?
As far as I understand, the reason why a lot of these coal power plants are retiring early is the Clean Power Plan 2.0. And those rules at the last minute, the EPA said they do not apply to current existing liquid natural gas power plants. So I think that's unlikely. But I mean, if they start applying to new ones and we start seeing liquid natural gas power plants, I don't see why data centers wouldn't try to take advantage of that. The same thing with the thing we talked about yesterday, where now there's a fight between data centers and residential power customers. We could see that move in that same direction, where data centers are now trying to take advantage of everything they can to make it as cheap as possible to connect.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Also, have you seen anything on the current solar storms? I did. I just saw where we had something the other day, but it didn't look like it was going to be like a direct hit or affect us in any significant way. Have you seen anything about that?
Yeah, I think there was a conference this week, NASA and NOAA saying that we're entering the solar maximum. And something about the next 12 months, we'll see a lot more solar activity. But as far as I understand, the solar storms, they'll only like impact the grid if, these power stations and power lines are at high altitudes. And they can affect things like GPS satellites and communication satellites, but I haven't seen anything about a specific storm yet that has impacted those.
Mm-hmm. All right. And then lastly, too, there's been talk of the Harris campaign having attorneys pre-positioned in each state to contest any negative election results. Isn't this typical of campaigns of the past? Yeah, it's Democrats and Republicans, literally hundreds of attorneys deployed all throughout the United States. Robert, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I think it was Democracy Defenders is the name of this new group they stood up for the 2024 election. Yeah, so they are ramping. I think they are ramping up a little bit this potential legal activity after the election.
Mm-hmm. It's going to be a dogfight of legal challenges. I think either way, especially something that we talked about yesterday about how counties in some of these states are going to be able to decide whether they want to certify the vote or not based off whatever, clean voter rolls, dirty voter rolls, whatever. All right, everyone, that is going to do it for today's early warning briefing. Just as a reminder, we'll be back at 10 a.m. Join Mark, Jared, Robert, myself, and Max Morton. We're going to talk about the election, what our current take is on the election fallout, and then also the biggest risk areas for the rest of the year. Let's put the election aside. It's a big deal, but there's more stuff going on other than the election. We'll discuss that. And that's going to start at 10 a.m. Central Time. And until then, everyone, be well and stay out front.